Welcome friends to Granny's GodPod number 73. It's been a while. My office chair broke before Christmas and it's no fun working at the kitchen table, but now it's fixed, so here I am at last to tell you about Lydia, an independent woman of the city of Thyatira. In the Apostle Paul's biblical letters, we find mention of people he knows well as companions or hosts, and who are not Jews. These must have been converted by him at some time, and Lydia was one of these somewhat unexpected friends. Paul, a Jewish scholar, had come from Jerusalem to convert pagans, despite the barriers of socio-economic differences, not to mention language, gender and place. Paul, Silas, Timothy and Luke had arrived at Philippi, which was a Roman colony and a leading city in the district of Macedonia. On the Sabbath, they had gone to a place of prayer at the riverside. When there was no synagogue, and in a military station like Philippi there wasn't likely to be one, the Jews frequented the riverbanks, which made ritual washing easy. It was there the missionaries sat down with a group of women, which included Lydia. The absence of men may be a result of the decree of Claudius expelling the Jews from Rome, also being enforced in the colonies. The women Paul found were probably faithful proselytes left behind without any instructors, and so would welcome these strangers, probably dressed as rabbis, ready to preach. Lydia was originally from Thyatira in Asia Minor, a female business owner involved in the ancient purple dye industry, a seller of purple goods. It was often the case that owners would name their slaves after their place of origin, which was far easier than trying to pronounce their proper names. If this was the case, Lydia's name may mean she came from the ancient territory of Lydia, now Western Turkey, and if so, she must now be a freed slave to have her own business. We don't know if Lydia was married, single, divorced or widows, as she is not associated with a man in the biblical text, nor do we know her age. It could be she was continuing an existing family business, or continuing a trade she had learned as a slave. Having reached the point where she could deal in expensive garments, she may still have been considered a relatively low-status person and a foreigner. Nonetheless, Lydia was important in the formation of a congregation in Philippi. When I was doing that theology course last year, we were told that Douglas Campbell's book, Paul, an Apostle's Journey, was the book to get on Paul. And on page 46 it says, Roman citizens had a carefully coded public profile. They wore a distinctive white, very expensive Roman garment, the toga, which was often marked with purple to denote their status. Children, magistrates and senators wore togas marked with purple bands of various widths, the toga praetexta, while emperors, higher magistrates and consuls wore the completely purple and comprehensively embroidered toga picta. Hence the saying, the emperor was born to the purple. The city of Philippi was a little Rome, and so copied the garments and codes of its mother city. And many people simply liked purple cloth. The trouble was, it was horrendously expensive. The bee's knees was Tyrian purple, which was obtained by crushing the purpura rock snails found in the eastern Mediterranean, especially around Tyre. The downside was that it took about 12,000 snails to produce the 1.4 grams of dye necessary to stain the hem of one garment. So even striped togas showed enormous wealth, which is why the Romans wore them. So the less wealthy settled for a cheaper substitute, derived from the madder plant known as dyer's red, which was found in the regions of Phrygia, Lydia, and elsewhere. While not as good as the genuine article, it was much cheaper. And Lydia seemed to be a person involved in this business, the ancient guild of purple dyers, purpurarii. Acts 16 verse 14 tells us she was a Jewish sympathiser or God worshipper. Even though Paul met Lydia in a Jewish meeting place, she was technically a pagan. Nonetheless, Paul converted her to the Christian faith, and she and her household were baptised. The Greek word oikos, O-I-K-O-S, means household or home. It doesn't refer to a building, but to an extended family. An ancient Roman household could include spouses, children, household servants, labourers, business associates, and tenants. Paul and his companions accepted Lydia's hospitality and stayed in her home during their ministry in Philippi. Maybe Lydia owned a villa, since her home must have had enough space for these visitors, and to provide her home as a base for the new church. In Jewish circles, Lydia as a woman would have had no more than a peripheral role. But in the new church at Philippi, she played a prominent role and was no doubt a benefactor in one way or another. A friendship formed on the river bank in Philippi might be a long way from the temple in Jerusalem, but Lydia's friendship with Paul led to a Christian community that lasted a long time. Excuse me. We know this because in 150 AD, Polycarp wrote a letter to the Christians there. In his missionary journeys, Paul often worked alongside people in their manual labour, for example, tent making with Priscilla and Aquila in Acts 18. He did the same in Thessalonica, and here he may have had Lydia's help. In those times, you only showed up in an ancient city unannounced and unknown if you had a death wish. There was no social welfare and little sympathy for outsiders. Without an introduction, starvation and exposure were quite likely, since local organisations protected the living of their own hand workers. Paul reached his destination via a network of artisans. Since Lydia knew and dealt with artisans as a business person and hand worker in the dye trade, it's very likely she was the key contact who enabled Paul's survival on the next part of his missionary journey to Thessalonica. Well, I hope that's given you some idea of the context of why Lydia is mentioned in the Bible. When someone is important enough to be named, it's always a good question to ask why, even when we are given the briefest of information. As someone once said, it's context, context, context. See you next time.